want to thank you all for taking the time out of your days to come together for our annual meeting. My name is Ritchie. I'm here on behalf of my company, Burkins, Ritchie and Associates, and this is your annual refresher for the Drug-Free Safety Program. Now, if you have not gone through the basic competencies course, I will touch on some of those principles, but there is an entire separate hour, and as new supervisors, you should have a minimum of 2 hours of supervisory training in addition to your annual employee education as well. So this makes up for the refresher hour. If you have not had the 1 hour of basic competencies, that's a different course. I also would like to remind you to please make sure you've signed in on your signature sheets. Those are important not only to make sure that you get paid for being here, but also make sure that you get credit for completing this annual training requirement. So the topic today is going to be getting back to some sense of normalcy, to maintaining a drug-free workplace in a post-pandemic world. Now, for our today's training, our key points that we're going to talk about: what are normal expectations, what are some of the impediments or the barriers that are getting in the way of us accomplishing those objectives. And I'm referring to those as kind of the elephants in the room. We'll also spend a little bit of time of talking about how we got here, diagnosing the situation, and then providing some solutions or some suggestions for a possible pathway forward about what we can do to address some of those hurdles. And then I have a homework assignment for you, which will be to re-examine some of the ways that we're doing things to see if what we're doing is working, and if not, what might work better. There are 4 basic responsibilities that we think encompass our responsibilities as supervisors. We have the responsibility to maintain a safe work environment, so we look at the goal of safety, of professionalism, of productivity, and of course profitability. All right. However, we're running into some hurdles in achieving some of those goals because of some of these elephants that I mentioned earlier. So some of those common elephants, some of those common barriers that I'm referring to are the supply chain disruptions, the labor shortage, the grind culture. I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that, the burnout and fatigue, and then the substance use and mental health issues that are coming out of those things. So these are all interconnected in such a way that I felt it was appropriate or apropos to tie those into a drug-free workplace class for supervisors, because we can troubleshoot some of these things. And because of the way that they are all tied in together, if we can troubleshoot them effectively, we can mitigate the impact that they're having on our workplace. So let's jump in. Now, for that first elephant, the supply chain disruptions, we may be seeing some of those issues resolved. It's certainly not as bad as it was in some industries at one point. We're getting a little relief. But I think the conventional wisdom is that this is something that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future. That some of these things are systemic, and until we get our capacity up to speed, we're going to be dealing with those. And so some things are within our control, some things are not. If we can at least control the controllables, then those other things will be a little bit more manageable as well, or a little bit more tolerable. Now, where we're really seeing a lot of issues is with the ongoing labor shortage. And to give you an idea, in the beginning of November 2022, we had 10.7 million open jobs. All right. And we had an unemployment rate of 3.5. Now, those are pre-pandemic numbers for at least for the unemployment. And because of that, it's leaving a lot of employers in a lurch. All right. And so it's having an outsized impact, particularly on those industries or on those sectors that are essential for keeping our day-to-day lives running. Of course, we're talking about the construction trades. Things have to be built, things have to be fixed. We're talking about manufacturing. Things have to be made, things have to be produced and sold and replaced. We're talking about the energy, about oil and gas. We have to be able to heat our homes and have the energy to keep our machines running and to get goods and services from place to place. We have to have transportation workers to make sure that those goods and services are being transported. We need to have healthcare workers to make sure that basic health needs are being met and that we can have a preventative care as we need it. Our safety service workers, our police, our firemen, and the catch-all of all the customer service workers and all the other essential workers out there. But these industries in particular are sectors where we have to have folks to get the job done, and there just aren't enough bodies that are willing to do the work at this point, or that are available to do the work. It just doesn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel. Now, as you can imagine, there are some pretty predictable outcomes that are coming out of this labor shortage. First off, and again, this isn't rocket science, we're finding that if you've got jobs that require a certain number of people to get the job done properly and in a timely manner, and you have less people to do it, then that means that there's going to be a shift of responsibility onto the workers who are there. And so there's more labor that's being divided among fewer workers. And so they push through, and it doesn't matter if we don't have enough people, it doesn't matter if we have enough time, that we figure out a way to get it done. And with that, it's often forcing us to conscribe workers into jobs that they aren't particularly comfortable performing. Let me give you an example. I personally don't mind driving. If my wife and I, or if my family and I go on road trips, I don't mind driving, and I don't get too stressed out generally when I'm driving. There's times when you're driving, or even if you don't mind it, when you're driving in particularly icy or slippery or terrible conditions, where it's that white knuckle driving, even if it's only generally a 5 or 10 minute commute, now it's taking 45 minutes, half an hour to do it. When you're feeling like what you're doing is unsafe, or you're unsure, or you're lacking confidence when you're doing it, it makes the experience considerably less enjoyable, considerably less satisfying. Fair enough? And so just because of necessity, we're finding ourselves in situations where we're having to look at the folks that we have available to us and say, you know what, I know you haven't done this for a long time, but I'm going to need you to do this today. And when you're already looking at situations where you don't have enough folks to do the job, on top of doing this job for longer than what they anticipated anyway, now they're doing a job that they're not comfortable doing for longer, and where they're showing up expecting an 8 to 10 hour day, and they're working 12, 14, 16, and they're doing it in a job where they're feeling uncomfortable or not particularly safe or competent. It amps up that stress. It adds a lot of extra stress and uncomfortability. And it contributes to the burnout that workers are starting to feel. The American Psychological Association has identified burnout syndrome as a bona fide mental health diagnosis. So if you're working those long hours, you're waking up, you're already feeling exhausted, you're starting to dread your job, you're starting to feel a separation or a distancing between yourself and your position, and now you're going in there day after day, and because there's no light at the end of the tunnel, and there's work from here to Timbuktu, it's not uncommon for me to talk to contractors who have work lined up years out. And when you have that kind of extra pressure and extra stress and extra demands placed on you, then that can significantly disrupt any kind of semblance of a work-home balance or a work-life balance. Most Americans spend more of their waking hours with the folks that they work with than they do with the people they live with. And so that leads to deterioration of those primary relationships in their lives, their relationships with their significant others and their children and their families. And so if we've got these jobs that have to get done and we have to stay late to get them done perpetually, and we are consistently choosing work over home, it can get to a point eventually where that relationship can deteriorate to the point where it's beyond repair. And when you have those types of traumatic life events going on with these workers, on top of them being burned out and fatigued, how does your body respond, or how do you feel when you are running on just a few hours of sleep? But now you're going home at the end of the day completely spent with everything that giving everything you had to getting the job done. By the time you get home, you're irritable, you just want a little space. Your loved ones want to spend a little bit of time with you, and those bids for attention are rebuffed. And it tends to lead to the breakdown of those families. And that leads to resentment, depression, more stress, more grief, anxiety. And as human beings, again, if you've ever been through any of my sessions, this will sound incredibly familiar. As human beings, we're pleasure-seeking and pain-avoiding creatures. And when we're experiencing physical pain or emotional pain, then we have a tendency to look for a way to feel better. And that's not unique just to only humans, it's to all mammals. And so we've got folks that are turning to increased substance use, and that substance use often, we're drinking more, we're taking more drugs, taking more medications, more street drugs, and that has a tendency to spiral and further exacerbate these underlying mental health issues, the depression, anxiety, stress, etc. If we don't break this cycle, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, some quick statistics to back up some of the points that I've been making. In 2021, our gross revenues for alcohol sales hit record highs in every single category that are directly attributable to excessive alcohol use, just in the state of Ohio. Of those who drink, nearly 1 in 3 Americans who consume alcohol in such a way that it places them at increased risk of alcohol dependence. These are folks that are drinking excessively on such a regular basis that it's putting them at risk of developing an alcohol use disorder and potentially alcohol dependency, which can be potentially deadly. Between 2020 and 2021, overdose deaths in the United States increased by 15%. And that was largely due to our streets getting flooded with synthetic opioids. There's a ton of fentanyl that's pouring into our country as a finished product. There's also a ton of fentanyl that's of these synthetic opioids that are being produced here from raw materials that are being obtained from around the world and shipped in, many of which that they're able to obtain legally, except for a few of the finishing chemical compounds that they need to get from the dark web or from the black market. And so not only are we getting the finished products shipped in, we're also getting the raw materials shipped in so that Americans are producing these here, and the profit motive is so attractive that folks are willing to kill their own to chase that dollar. And I imagine that there are a lot of folks who are getting involved in that B world of illegal activity who are missing from those 10.7 million open jobs as well. The persistent use of the comeback of the cocaine and the methamphetamine, I don't believe that's coincidental. Can anybody think of any reason why stimulant misuse would come back in vogue during this particular time?
Deal with stress.
To deal with stress, of course, and to deal with fatigue, right? If folks are perpetually burned out and are dealing with perpetual fatigue, where they're working these exceedingly long hours, a lot of it is to try to get that extra energy to be able to complete the task. I mean, there's a reason why there's a coffee pot in virtually every office in the United States. It's because caffeine's a performance-enhancing drug. It's a stimulant.
And for this to ease and accessibility too.
Sure. I think it's a great point for those who may not have been able to hear the comment. Beyond the substance use issues, According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, mental health is one of the biggest dangers that's affecting the construction industry. This was a shocking statistic when I came across it. And that was that more construction workers die annually from suicide than from on-the-job accidents. In the fiscal year 2021, according to OSHA, they had 976 work-related fatalities on construction and extraction jobs. Any guesses on how many suicides we had? Anybody want to take a very close? We had the guess 2,036, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Unbelievable. But it's going on, and this spiraling cycle that we're talking about is a huge contributing factor. And so I'm going to touch on some of these topics a little bit as we go through. On overdoses, on suicide, I'll tread lightly, but I want to make sure that folks have the tools they need in the event they come across some of these situations, that you know how to address them properly, all right, particularly in your roles. All right. So how in the world did we get here? There are some common threads that run through this, and I'd like to go through them. There's approximately 10 that I want to touch on very quickly. First off, as a country, and really around the world, we got blindsided by the pandemic. We got caught flat-footed, and because of that, we had this rampant, out of control public health emergency that just turned our lives upside down. That ended up being a mass casualty and a mass trauma event, and what that left in its wake was a whole bunch of grief and a whole lot of uncertainty, and a whole lot of depression, and a whole lot of anxiety, and a whole lot of trauma. Many of you are old enough to remember what happened back in 2001. Some of you remember, I'm sure if you were old enough, you remember precisely where you were on September 11th, when during those 102 minutes we lost nearly 3,000 American souls. It wasn't only the attack itself that was so traumatic for us, but it was the response. The fact that we had this constant reminders of it, the image of it seared into our brains by being exposed to it over and over and over again. And that had the effect of having us live in an extended period of heightened fear and extended our trauma. And we had this extended mass trauma event, and we saw significant spikes in alcohol use, in addiction, overdoses, suicides. And then we put infrastructure in place and systems in place to address those problems. With that event in 2001, we lost 3,000 Americans. It was a horrific attack, but we lost 3,000. Over the last couple of years, we've lost over 1 million. And on top of all of those empty chairs around the table, on top of the isolation, the inability to properly grieve and grieve the folks that we lost, where we couldn't attend their funerals, where we couldn't be at their bedsides, where we couldn't be around each other, where we had this constant ticker going on of telling us how many people are infected, how many people are dying. Seeing these images on TV of the mobile morgues and the mass graves and all the other things. And folks, it was traumatizing for us. It was traumatic. And guess what? We saw 20-year highs in alcohol use disorders, overdoses, suicides, just like we did back in 2001. It's predictable. with that mass loss of life and all of that grief, it forced us to take a look at what was going on. And many of us were forced to confront the fragility of our lives. And all of a sudden we had to confront it. And this pandemic touched our lives very directly for many of us, where we lost loved ones. And if we didn't, we were worried that we were going to. And instead of the country coming together like it did after 9/11, where we had an external threat, this just became fodder for further division. And so on top of not only having this invisible virus that was going around, we also saw partisan and tribal divisions going on, where people were, even when they were able to get back together, were deliberately choosing to stay away from each other. I've never seen anything like it in my life. But we got this suffering going on, and as folks started realizing that, you know what, maybe I'm not guaranteed a tomorrow, they started re-examining how they were spending the time that they do have. And a lot of folks, all of a sudden, were kind of snapped out of that zombie-like hamster wheel they were on. And they decided, you know what, this isn't what I want to do. And they started making plans to pursue things that were more meaningful to them. And that led in many ways to what we're largely seeing described as the Great Resignation, where all of a sudden folks were just started leaving their jobs and deciding they could get by with less, that they could do their side hustle or do gig work, and if they just tighten their belts a little bit, they could make ends meet, and they didn't have to put up with all the pressures that they were putting up with otherwise. And so that has further exacerbated all of these vacancies, because now we've got folks that are saying, you know, well, I know I can go back now, but do I want to? While this was going on, and while we had all these vacancies and all this work that had to be done and fewer people to do it, then it was only natural. I don't in any way believe it was deliberate, but many of us started just slipping into survival mode. We did what we had to do to get by. When folks are in survival mode, I mean, there's a reason why when there's a fire in a theater that folks often get trampled as people are trying to escape. They don't have time to be orderly and polite. During times of emergencies, people do sometimes extraordinary things, sometimes they behave in ways that they wouldn't normally behave. And so we had these folks that were companies that were demanding more and more of their workers who were becoming more and more resentful, and a very simple thing that got dropped along the way was that companies often stopped, employers often stopped communicating effectively with their workers. It was just get the thing done. It wasn't because they didn't care about it or that they didn't want to. It was just that wasn't top of mind. Top of mind was getting the job done. But in the absence of communication, we write our own story. And the story that we often tell ourselves may be far different from what somebody else's intentions were. We may care to our core about the well-being of our workers. It may kill us that we need for them to work extra to get this thing done, to meet this contractual deadline that we have. You know, We may be doing everything we can to backfill those jobs. But if we're not communicating it to those workers, what the workers see is there's no end in sight and nothing's being done and no reinforcements are coming to support their flank. And so that survival mode that created that tunnel vision often led people to start cutting corners and to blurring boundaries. And we swung too far on both ends in many cases. So if we want to get back to good, then we need to address that lack of communication that led to burnout, that led to that cynicism, that lack of trust. And we need to start rebuilding that trust with our workers. When I'm talking about cynicism, as Americans, traditionally, we've had a very close association between our personal identity and our professional identity. And it's just been in the last couple of years that has broken, where there's more daylight between the two, and that daylight's often filled with cynicism. And cynicism being a lack of belief that their employer cares about them and that their coworkers care about them. And in return, that cynicism is reflected. Now, it may not have anything to do with the employer actually caring or actually, or what they're doing, but if they don't believe it, perception is reality. Right? And if we can do that, then we can at least stop bleeding workers to burnout and attrition. We can start retaining the good workers that we have, and then start working on recruiting more workers to backfill the vacancies that are gone. How do we get back to good? First off, managing our human resources effectively, working smarter, not harder. And the 5 Ps, proper planning prevents poor performance. Making sure that when the folks get out there that we've got a plan for them, that we're utilizing them well, that we're delegating our workers to their strengths whenever possible. Now again, I also understand sometimes we don't have a person who has that strength and we have to make do with what we got. Making sure that we're assigning realistic workloads to folks so that they don't show up and look at it and start off defeated before they even begin, because they realize that there's no way on earth that they don't feel like they're ever going to be able to get it done. And then checking in regularly with your workers and just making sure that, checking in to see how they're doing. Just the simplest thing, one of the most important things we can do to build loyalty and retention is just checking in on a daily basis and asking our workers how they are. How you doing? And not doing it with a 1,000-yard stare past them, actually asking them and caring. How are you? And taking a moment to engage with them. If they feel like you actually care, that matters. Because we're working on rebuilding that bridge, of backfilling that gap of cynicism that was created. It's simple things. And there are studies being done that just checking in, asking how they're doing, actively listening, maintaining eye contact, having some physical contact with a person if they're comfortable with it. A handshake, a high five, a knuckle touch. Checking in and caring and listening. If we're interested in getting better at most things, we can. Beyond those simple interpersonal skills, making sure that we're communicating what we need with our workers, that we're setting clear expectations, and so that folks know what they want from us. We've talked about it for years about having that good engagement with the employees at the beginning of each shift. Setting those clear expectations organizationally and individually, getting and giving regular feedback from our workers, praising publicly, correcting privately, and then treating everyone with dignity and respect. I mean, that golden rule goes a long way. It's simple, but it's critical. Our partner companies who do exit interviews with the folks that are leaving due to attrition can often trace the reason why they're leaving back to one particularly toxic individual, or to a culture where they feel like that they are not appreciated. It can make a big difference. And again, if you have a hard time with that, just think about how would you want the person that you care the most about to be treated, and try to treat other people that way. As far as we're talking about the supply chain disruptions, where we can't get more than what we have, we can manage what we have well. And so making sure that we are driving home the idea of safety first. Nothing will slow down a project like an accident or an injury, and nothing will chew up materials like having to have some accident where you have to tear apart what you've already done and redo it and burn up the materials and the man hours. Making sure that we're engaging with those workers to set those clear expectations, making sure that we're asking those engagement questions. Are you clear what we need you to do today? Do you have what you need to do it? Is there anything we haven't discussed that would prevent you from doing it? Being able to check their fitness for duty at the beginning of the shift. Making sure they're sufficiently mentally alert and physically capable of safely doing their jobs. And rewarding them when they're doing a good job. And be open to listening to their way of doing it. Believe it or not, we're not always right. And sometimes the person who's actually doing the work has good ideas. Even if it doesn't significantly reduce the amount of time it takes to do the job, even if it gets done in the same amount of time, if the person is willing to do it that way, and if they're both equally effective ways to do it, then that person has engagement in what they're doing. They know that their opinion is valued, and it's going to make them, again, build that trust that you care about what they have to say. And then when it comes to substance use disorders, when you suspect that somebody may be drinking or having a problem with alcohol or other substances, going through that 6-step constructive confrontation process, again, that we've covered in the basic competencies course ad nauseum, but those 6 steps, observe, investigate, confirm, confront, transport, and document. Making sure that you have those steps down and that you understand what your company's protocol is for those steps. So that if one of these situations comes up, that you know what to do and how to handle it properly. And remember that we're never in this alone. That if you are in one of those situations and you're not exactly sure, then reach out to each other. There's 3 legs to that stool. There's the initiating supervisor, there's the confirming supervisor, there's the designated employer representative. And anybody who's completed this training is qualified to offer feedback for you or suggestions. There are going to be times when all of us draw a blank. The older I get, the more often it happens, But I'm very grateful that I have those lifelines to reach out to. And guess what? There'll be times when those people are going to drop blanks and they're going to ask you to. That's what we do as a team. Finally, it's important that we talk about what to do if we are concerned that someone may be suicidal. We've had 2 of our partner companies that I've worked with for a long time lose individuals in the last year to suicide. In both cases, in hindsight, the folks who were directly involved with them felt like they were preventable. You never know. But it's important to know what to look for. And so these are from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. A very obvious indicator is folks talking about suicide or self-harm. Folks, if people are talking about suicide and you overhear it, please don't assume that they're joking or that they're just blowing off steam or they're just venting. It might not be. It's a natural reaction for us as human beings because we experience denial. That's why folks who are having chest pains and feel like they have an elephant sitting on their chest and pain shooting up their arm and their neck and are showing all the classic signs of a heart attack don't want to believe that they're having a heart attack, and so they delay going to the hospital because they don't want to believe it's happening. We don't want to believe that somebody that we know is contemplating ending their life, but they may be. If they're talking about it, it's a potential warning sign. Them expressing that they feel hopeless or powerless. If there are circumstances beyond their control that they find to be unbearable. If they're feeling trapped or they have no way out. Again, that sense of desperation. if they begin engaging in particularly reckless behavior. Now some of these can be indicators of lots of things, but they can also be indicators of potential suicidality. Withdrawing from loved ones, family and friends. Performance issues at work. Significant changes to their mood. We see significant mood swings or changes to their significant weight loss or changes to their sleep patterns. Significant increases in their substance use. And then giving away prized possessions. We'll come back to that one in a minute. Now, if you are concerned that someone may be contemplating suicide, all right, there are 5 simple steps. And again, for those of you who went through the employee session, you're already seeing these. For those of you who are going to this afternoon, then we're going to be actually watching a video to go over this in more detail, but it's important. First step in the process is to ask directly. If you believe that they may be suicidal, ask them, are you okay? And if they tell you that they're not, and they start giving you some of these other warning signs, ask them, are you thinking about suicide? Asking, the research is irrefutable. Asking a person if they are suicidal does not make them more likely to complete a suicide. If they're thinking about it, they're already thinking about it. If they're not prone to it, they're not going to because you brought it up. Ask them directly. And then listen. And when you listen without judgment and listen without jumping in. And I understand that a lot of us want to do this out of a well-intentioned desire to relate to the person, but don't try to one-better them. Don't tell them that, as they're talking about what's going on with them, say, oh, it'll be okay. I went through this, and making it about you. This is an important time for us to keep buttoned and listen to what they're saying. You may be the only person that they have talked to about this. For whatever reason, in that moment, your fate may have brought them across your path, and they're opening up to you. You've noticed, you've cared enough to ask, and they're telling you, listen. Ask them if they've got a plan, how they would do it, if they have a time to do it. And then be there for them. Listen to them, do what you can to keep them safe. If they have said that they have a specific means that they want to do. For example, I've held guns for friends and loved ones on numerous occasions. I had a friend hand me a bag full of pills that he was planning to take to end his life at one point. I held on to those items until the person was in a better place to be able to cope with the situation that they were dealing with. By the way, every one of those individuals is still alive, and that gentleman and I actually flushed those pills together. The guy with the pills just got married. He just celebrated a sobriety anniversary. He's medication compliant at this point. But putting time and distance between it with the person, and then connecting them up with resources to help them. I've got a poster that I'm going to be giving to Human Resources today. There's a new crisis intervention line that's been made available by the Department of Health and Human Services called 988. You can call it, you can text it, you can go online and chat with the individuals there. The line is manned by certified, licensed mental health professionals who know how to interact with folks who are in crisis and to help to de-escalate them and connect them up with resources. And it's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I've got a poster for you that I'll be leaving with you. But you can connect them up with that. You can connect them up with your EAP services. You can connect them up with your Employee Assistance Program services. You can connect them up with mental health services if need be. You don't have to play psychiatrist. You don't have to play counselor. What you can be is a bridge. And then after you've made the connection, after you've connected them up with that help, then follow up with them. You don't have to be their best friend. You don't have to invite them over to live with you or to break bread with you every day. But at least check in with them periodically. Ask them, how are you doing? Are you okay? Do you need anything? Again, just letting them know that someone cares. And when folks are in that are being swallowed up by that darkness of depression, they often feel like nobody cares about them. And you may be that, and you checking in may make the difference, may make a huge difference. You never know. Only takes us a moment, it may make all the difference in the world to them. Beyond that, the homework that I have for you, that I mentioned before, coming in here and just talking about what booze smells like, or what weed smells like, or what the different types of pills are and all that stuff. I'll talk about some of that stuff during the employee session. But bottom line, you know what? We need to be preventative in this situation. We need to turn off the spigot instead of running for the mop. And so my question for you is, after having this discussion today, after having this time to think about some of the stuff that we've been going over, are there some things within your organization that you could be doing better? Are there some things that aren't working right now? What does working look like? What would it look like if it was working perfectly? And if it's not working, then what could we do differently? What could we do better? Those are really important questions. That's where we get down to making things better. Because it's easy to stay on the hamster wheel. It's easy to keep doing it. But if we're dealing with attrition, if we're dealing with perpetual labor shortage, throwing more money at wages isn't working because everybody else is doing it too. You've got to do something else to stand out. There are companies now that are creating recovery-friendly workplaces because there's been such a lowering of standards and such a race to the bottom in some industries because of the labor shortage. What employers did out of desperation in some cases was just started lowering their standards. So, well, I need people on the job, and if I keep holding them to these standards, I'm not going to get anybody, so I better lower my standard. And it's just a downward spiral. And so at some point, it just occurred to them that, you know what, maybe we could flip that on its head. I bet you there's a bunch of people who don't want to work in those kind of situations. And those are becoming safe havens. Those are becoming attractive employers where they're being drawn to those places where they know they're not going to be working next to somebody who's going to be drunk or high or who's not going to be cutting corners with safety because the culture doesn't promote that. The state of Ohio also has a new substance use recovery and workplace safety program that is fully reimbursing training costs, significantly reimbursing the cost for substance testing, up to $1,500 a year, I believe. It's reimbursing the cost to have policies revisited and reviewed and updated and reviewed by outside counsel, and all that is reimbursable. And all you have to do is send in a 2-minute application. The changes that you want to make within your organization aren't going to be cookie cutter. You may see some areas that can be improved that other places don't have. We would be happy to work with you in those capacities to improve those areas for you and to help you to brainstorm and to problem solve through some of those areas if you're feeling stuck. Bottom line, though, once you identify the problems there, then you want to ask yourself the 5 basic questions. What's the problem? Who's going to be responsible for fixing it? Who does it pertain to? When is the change going to happen? Where are we going to go to get the help? Or where is this going to take place? And how is it going to get done? And we can apply those 5 basic questions to any of those areas in need of improvement. And if we're willing to do that homework, if we're willing to take a moment and be insightful instead of being defensive, then we can find our way back to good. None of us wanted things to get to where they are now. But I believe that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that we can get there. And we just have to be willing to do the work to get there together. All right. Any questions for me about anything we've gone over? Okay. If not, then I want to thank you all for your time and your attention. Please have a fantastic rest of the day, and I look forward to catching up with you for our next meeting. Thank you, folks.